helpless, afraid, wondering if perhaps the world would be better off without me. Those were some of the emotions that plagued much of my preteen and teenage years. My early childhood was in many ways idyllic, especially at home. I had loving parents who had a vibrant relationship with God and were respected leaders in our church. My older sister and brother and I were a close trio, best friends, and all successful in school and in many areas of life. My parents created a home for us that was warm, loving, and structured, yet flexible enough for us to explore our own passions and giftings. I asked Jesus to live in me when I was just 4 years old, and since then, he has always been my closest friend. From a young age, I regularly witnessed the tangible faithfulness and power of God, and several truths were implanted deep in my soul. That God is omniscient, that he is omnipresent, that he is all-powerful, that his word is true, and that he answers prayer. At the age of 10 or 11, however, a significant shift began to take place in my life. I felt increasingly out of place among boys. My friends were getting more involved in sports, and I could hardly throw or catch a ball for the life of me. My primary interest was music, and I could play for hours on end on my own. Unbeknownst to my parents, I was a frequent target of physical bullying. I was small, and still am small, and nerdy, and so apparently a prime target. My brother and I were best friends, but outside of that, I didn't see any reason to go out of my way to connect with other boys. And so I started to hang out with girls more. I just seemed to connect and relate with them better than with boys. At home, there was increasing tension between my dad and me. I became very critical of him and was quick to point out his imperfections and put him on the defense, unaware that in doing so, I was closing my heart off from receiving his expressions of love and affirmation of the man I was becoming. I began to develop a resentment toward men in general. Yet I didn't reject the concept of masculinity in itself. In fact, I determined to become the ideal Christian man. To compound matters, around this time, my family moved to a new home nearby. I started attending a new school with virtually none of my former classmates, and my family changed churches. So it was really a time of much instability. Now, this was the mid-1990s, and the phenomenon of this thing called the internet, you may have heard of it, began to sweep across the world. The invention of the internet was truly a great advancement for humanity. But at the same time, with that advancement came great challenges. And at the onset of puberty, I stumbled across one of those challenges: internet pornography. But along with that discovery came an even more troubling one, that I was attracted exclusively to men. Not only was this troubling, but it was also bewildering. Having grown up in a strong Christian family and knowing the Bible, I knew that pornography and homosexuality were outside of God's intent for sexuality, and yet here I was, intensely attracted to men. Gay porn hooked a deep longing within me. It seemed to fill a mysterious void. The men I saw in pornography seemed strong and masculine, yet in their lustful eyes I felt desired, accepted, understood, and wanted, and safe. And I craved for more. When profound brokenness is met by a possible antidote to that brokenness, it is like water to a parched desert. For me, the antidote was homoerotic desire and sexual addiction. But in reality, it was slowly poisoning my soul and quickly consuming my inner world. I desperately wanted help, but didn't feel like I could talk to anyone about my shameful secret. And no one asked. By all outward appearances, I was doing well. I was held in high esteem as a student, Christian, and musician. And the church didn't seem like a safe place to be open about my struggles. That perception, whether true or not, was confirmed by the occasional comments I heard at youth group about gay people being gross, or hearing another boy share that he had distanced himself from a friend who came out to him as gay for fear that that friend would make sexual advances. Secrecy seemed far better to me than rejection, and secrecy became a fertile breeding ground for accusation and shame. Yet I knew that God was all-powerful and could heal me in an instant. And so I pleaded again and again for God to heal me. But instead, my attractions to men were only growing stronger as I was descending deeper and deeper into addiction. By the age of 17, I didn't know how much longer I would be able to resist the relentless and intense longing to connect sexually with another man. And yet I also couldn't turn my back on God, nor did I want to. I'd seen too much to deny his existence, power, and faithfulness. And I knew at the end of the day, if I had nothing else, I had God. Many nights I prayed that God would take me in my sleep. The burden and the pain just seemed too great to bear. And so here I was, alone, ashamed, helpless, afraid, desperate. And finally, the moment of breakthrough came. God had not ignored my prayers. God led me to the online forum provided by Living Hope Ministries for Christian youth dealing with unwanted same-sex attractions, led by Ricky Chalette. And for the first time, I realized I was not alone. I could be open about my struggles without fear of judgment or rejection, and shame began to break off of me. I was so glad that no one offline would ever have to know about my struggles. I could privately resolve my issues and move on with my life. God apparently had other plans. After many months of wrestling with God, I finally built up the courage to talk to my youth pastor. For an incredibly awkward half hour, I struggled to break through fear and shame, to squeak out the words, I struggle with same-sex attraction. And he didn't reject me. He wasn't disgusted by my secret struggle. Instead, he said that he was not surprised because everyone deals with something, he said. And he told me that he was proud of me for telling him. We began to meet regularly, and my heart took a small step toward trusting men. Disclosing to my parents was even more difficult. After all, out of shame and fear, I had hidden my struggles from them for 6 or 7 years, all while living under the same roof. I had viewed explicit material in their home countless times, material of which they most definitely would not have approved. How would this affect our relationship? Would they ever be able to trust me again? But God had prepared their hearts, and to my relief, they responded graciously. The time came to head off to college, and there, I like to say that I experienced masculine relationship on steroids. A lot of hormones in that age group. But I got connected with a men's Bible study in my dorm, and every week we crammed about 25 men into a modestly sized dorm room. And I was literally surrounded by men who embraced me as one of their own. Even after I disclosed my struggles with same-sex attraction and sexual addiction. I learned much about healthy masculinity simply through being around these men, and I began to develop an identity as a man among men. God continued to bring other godly men into my life, and time again, I was met with love and uncompromising compassion. Many of these men resembled the very men I had despised and with whom I had thought I would never be able to relate. but they became my closest friends and played a vital role in my healing. I desperately longed for intimacy with other men, but I had pursued it in sinful ways. And now that healthy, godly men were pouring love, acceptance, and strength into me, my parched soul drank it up. These men lifted me up in prayer time and time again, displayed God's grace to me fall after fall, and encouraged me in my pursuit of holy living. They accepted me when I couldn't accept myself, embraced me when I was overwhelmed with shame, and fought for me when I felt like giving up. Although our struggles looked different on the outside, at the core we had the same needs and desires. Because ultimately the healing of male homosexuality is the healing of the masculine soul. However, by the end of my freshman year of college, I began to relapse back into pornography, and this time deeper than ever before. I reached out to Outpost Ministries and began meeting with Nate Oilo. And to my surprise, my first assignment seemed to have nothing to do with homosexuality at all. My assignment was to wait on God daily, to listen for his voice. And I don't necessarily mean the audible voice of God, but the myriad of ways that he speaks to his children. And as I began to listen to God, he spoke his incredible love over me and affirmed my true identity as his son and as a man of strength. While I had never taken on a gay identity, in many ways I'd still allowed my struggles and to define me. My behavior and struggles had become blurred with my identity. And yet here was God, the one who created me and knew me best, telling me that he loved me and delighted in me and how proud he was of me. God also began to illuminate the inner workings of my heart. You see, up to this point, I had seen my sexual struggles as driven primarily by sexual impulse that I somehow needed to just get under control. And while that was true to a degree, God and trusted others in my life began to help me to identify the deeper unresolved emotional issues that were fueling my homoerotic desires and behaviors. Issues I had long medicated and covered up with porn and other coping mechanisms. My physical behaviors were simply outward expressions of these underlying issues like skewed views of God and masculinity, misandry that is hatred of men, but also idolatry of men, unforgiveness and bitterness toward the men who had wounded me, and self-hatred. I discovered that the cross was so much more than a symbol of salvation, but that in the crucified body of Jesus, there was a place for all my sin, hurt, and shame. I invited God into these painful places to bring the healing that only he could bring. And Father poured his love into the deep void in my heart. Jesus spoke his powerful words of healing into painful memories and experiences. And the Holy Spirit began to teach me to correctly discern the core desires of my heart and to seek the fulfillment of those desires in the ways God intended, instead of in sinful ways. And as I pressed into God for healing in each of these areas, the lust for other men to fill the void in my soul and satisfy me began to lose power over me. And attractions to women began to emerge. Now, if this was a fairy tale, which it's not, this is where you would expect and they lived happily ever after. But that's not often how emotional healing works. It's not always an upward trajectory in the day-to-day. The devil and our old sinful nature don't go down easily without a fight. The emotional healing I experienced, rather than being the end-all and be-all solution, rather it cleared and demolished the obstacles inhibiting me from making headway in growing as a disciple of Christ. Familiar ways of escaping from the pains and challenges of life didn't instantaneously disappear. In fact, in the years to come, I would descend again even deeper into addiction, even as I was actively pursuing healing. I would cross lines that I thought I would never cross. I would resign from a part-time position at a church due to my sexual addiction, a truly rock bottom season. But God was with me through it all, for God never leaves or forsakes his children. And one day at a time, I increasingly learned to walk in obedience by the Spirit and God's grace. Galatians 5 tells us that there will be a continuing battle between our old sinful nature and the Spirit now at work within us. But it also says, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Amen. So I needed to learn to walk by God's Spirit. And I also needed to learn to abide in God's grace, which, according to Titus 2, trains us to renounce all ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled and upright and godly lives in the present age as we wait for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a treasured possession, a people who are eager to do good works. Today, I am no longer enslaved by the bondage of sexual sin and disordered desires. My old life has been crucified with Christ, and my inward man is being renewed day by day in the knowledge of my Creator. The avenues and the people and the ministries God has used as his agents of healing are honestly too many to count. He has redeemed my past, and as he so often does, is using it for the healing and redemption of others. I have the privilege of serving with Restory Ministries, helping churches to become healing communities so that new stories of transformation can be told. In 2014, my existence as a single man enjoying deep relationship with God and with other believers was pleasantly interrupted. I was on vacation with my family in Hong Kong, my father's birthplace, hiking a beautiful island mountain, when all of a sudden I thought, if Sarah were here, she would be enraptured by this beauty. Now, Sarah was a woman in the small group I was leading, but why was I thinking about her? Was I attracted to her? Fast forward several months full of prayer and confirmation, and Sarah's life was interrupted by her small group leader asking to meet up for tea. That's yours truly. Unbeknownst to her, to express his desire to pursue a romantic relationship with her. We wed in 2017, and I can say that we are happily married and grateful to be navigating life's joys and challenges. We're happy to be navigating life's joys and challenges under the lordship of Christ, and our love for one another continues to blossom. I am genuinely attracted to her and see her as the most beautiful woman in the world. Marriage has been a byproduct, not the source of healing. That's right. And again, we find ourselves in a new chapter of life, raising our delightful 10-month-old son. Yeah. God has brought much restoration in my relationship with my earthly father. In forgiving him and letting go of all resentment against him, I have been freed to receive his love and the wonderful heritage of the generation before me. And I now desire to follow in my father's legacy of wisdom, humility, generosity, servanthood, leadership, and love for God and family. My life is not absent of temptation, nor is life always easy. That is part of living in a fallen world. But my life is absolutely better, brighter, and freer. I have found that it is impossible to walk closely with Christ and not be changed. The very nature of walking with Christ is such that as we see him more clearly, we are transformed from glory to glory into his likeness. So my name is Michael Newland, and this is my story.